Welcome to my World History Notes, and I'm sharing with you things I'm learning about the Cold War. I'm reading from various books, studying, cross-referencing, and hopefully, if you'll have an interest in some of these things, be able to look them up yourself, confirm whether you think I'm right or not. And we're going to go on because the Cold War, the struggle against communism, I can see very clearly continues to this day. So it didn't really end. Just some of the players have changed a little bit. So let me begin today with the mission of Vice President Wallace to China in the summer of 1944. That intensified the pressure on Chiang Kai shek's government to improve the situation of the communists. Wallace was accompanied by Vincent Lattimore, which we know were um, Soviet agents. Vincent testified that he first heard about the Wallace mission from Curry, Lachlan Curry, Owen Lattimore, Lachlan Curry. He said he met Wallace in Curry's office. Vincent acknowledged that he advised and influenced Wallace throughout his journey, particularly during his talks with Chiang. He steered the conversations between Chiang and Wallace toward a settlement with the communists, and he induced Wallace to emphasize that such a settlement was desired by the United States. Now, Vincent's own notes on one conference with Chiang, published in the State Department's white paper on China, said, Mr. Wallace also pointed out that if, as President Chiang stated, the Chinese communists were linked with the USSR, then there was even greater need for settlement. Now, there was a report to President Roosevelt dated July 10, 1944, and in it Wallace declared, quote, Chiang at best is a short-term investment, is not believed he has intelligence or political strength to run post-war China. The leaders of post-war China will be brought forward by evolution or revolution, and it now seems more likely the latter. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Didn't expect the phone call. Okay, so before leaving China, Wallace sent the president a cablegram recommending the replacement of General Joseph Stilwell by General Wiedemeyer, whose diary I'm reading now, whose recollections is his biography, as commander of American forces in China. Apologists for the Wallace mission have maintained that this was an anti-communist recommendation, since Stilwell was pro-communist and hated Chiang, while Wiedemeyer was strongly anti-communist and pro-Chiang. However, the official Soviet policy at the time was to keep Chiang's armies in the war against Japan, and the communists desired an effective American military advisor for Chiang. The Communist Daily Worker supported Wiedemeyer's appointment, not because he was pro-communist, but because he was effective. He would keep Chiang in the war against Japan. The report of the Seventh National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, dated May 1st, 1945, called for a, quote, independent, free, democratic, unified, strong, and prosperous new China. On June 24th, 1945, the National Committee of the American Communist Party adopted a resolution calling for a, quote, strong, united, and democratic China. Watch that word democracy, how it's used when it's used by the communists, especially nowadays when they say our democracy. Totally different thing than what you're thinking. On June 10, 1945, Lattimore wrote a letter to President Truman warning that American aid to Chiang might encourage the Russians to support the Chinese communists. He followed up his letter with a personal visit to the White House on July 3rd, when he left a memorandum urging a, quote, settlement between Chiang and the communists, and simultaneously an agreement between America, Russia, and Britain to build up China as a whole. Now, Lattimore, a communist, said that communists would have to accept, quote, minority status, but that Chiang would, quote, have to give them real power within a coalition government proportionate to their real strength, not just token representation. And we're talking about a communist party, communist forces led by Mao Zedong, who was a thug and a murderer of millions. So basically a criminal. Lattimore's proposal was the essence of the program laid down by Stalin, another criminal, a program finely designed. His goal was to achieve a Soviet China. It was a policy demanded by Mao Zedong's Communist Party in China and by the Communist Party of the United States. After Lattimore's visit to the White House, it became the official policy of the United States government. On November 28, 1945, Vincent, who was the new director of the State Department's Far Eastern Division, drafted suggestions for a course of action closely following Lattimore's recommendations to the president. On December 9, 1945, Vincent drafted a memorandum for the War Department for its guidance in sending directives to General Wiedemeyer in China. This memorandum, signed by Burns, B-Y-R-N-A-E-S, said the President and Secretary of State were anxious that the, quote, unification of China by peaceful, democratic methods be achieved as soon as possible. It quoted a statement by Burns made before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on December 7th that Chiang's government, quote, must be broadened to include the representatives of those large and well-organized groups who are now without any voice in the government, unquote. And the American influence would be exerted to encourage concessions both by the central government and by the, quote, so-called communists. Thus, the Secretary of State had adopted the communist propaganda line that the Chinese communists were not really communists, but merely agrarian reformers. The Vincent Memorandum to the War Department also stated that President Truman had asked General Marshall to go to China as a special representative in efforts to bring the Chinese communists into the central government. The War Department was requested to issue instructions to General Wiedemeyer that the transportation of Chinese troops to North China for action against the communists was to be held in abeyance pending the outcome of Marshall's discussions with Chinese leaders. This was directed contrary to General Wiedemeyer's recommendations. On November 20th, reporting to the War Department, the general said, quote, I have recommended to the Generalissimo that he should concentrate his efforts upon establishing control in North China. The memorandum to the War Department, signed by Burns but drafted by Vincent, together with a statement of policy issued by the President on December 15, 1945, constituted Marshall's instructions for his China mission. Vincent testified before the Internal Security Subcommittee that he wrote the original draft of the President's statement, that Marshall expanded it, and that final changes were made by the State Department before the President issued it. He admitted that it closely followed his outline of a suggested course of action dated November 28th. Using language taken verbatim from the resolution of the Communist Party, the President's statement called for a, quote, strong, united, democratic China. It proposed a national conference of Chinese leaders to unite China and declared that, quote, all armed forces in China should be integrated exclusively into the Chinese National Army. This meant, of course, that Chiang should unite the Chinese Communist armies with his own, as Stalin had demanded. Finally, the President's statement promised American assistance as China moved, quote, toward peace and unity, implying that Chiang would get nothing if he refused to form a coalition with the communists. We'll talk about what happened when Marshall arrived in China in 1945 next. I hope you'll study. I got a lot of this from Manley's 20-Year Revolution. A lot of good information, a lot of stuff backed up by citations. So I hope that you'll be interested in studying the Cold War. It's very important. The implications and the after effects and the consequences did not just end in this, what you might think of as an old period of time in history. It's very important for what's happening today. We'll get to that if I live long enough. So I just hope that you study this, consider it, and speak your mind.